Ask any random American who would win a war between the United States and Iran, and the answer comes fast. America, and it wouldn't even be close. Bigger military, bigger budget, better technology, overwhelming firepower, and on paper, that math checks out. The United States spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. Iran's entire military budget is less than what the Pentagon loses in accounting errors. But here's the problem with that assumption. The United States has not won a major war in 50 years. Not Vietnam, not Lebanon, not Somalia, not Iraq, not Afghanistan. 5 decades, 5 conflicts, 5 withdrawals, and every single one followed. The same pattern: tactical dominance, strategic failure, and an enemy still standing when American forces finally left. Iran has studied every single one of those failures, and they have built their entire military strategy around making sure the pattern repeats. So the question is not who has the bigger military, the question is whether. Size still matters when the other side has spent half a century learning how to make it irrelevant. Look at the record. In 1973, the United States withdrew from Vietnam after a decade of combat operations that killed 58,000 American troops, cost over $168 billion in period money, dropped more tonnage of bombs than all of World War II combined, and ended with Saigon falling too. The very enemy America had spent 10 years trying to destroy. Tactical victories on nearly every engagement. Strategic failure so total that the government America propped up collapsed within 2 years of withdrawal. Move forward 10 years to Beirut, October 1983. A suicide truck bomb kills 241 American servicemen at the Marine barracks. The United States had deployed peacekeepers to Lebanon as part of a multinational force during the Lebanese Civil War. The Reagan administration promised resolve. 4 months later, all American forces withdrew. The mission accomplished nothing. The adversary Hezbollah, backed by Iran, learned that American tolerance for casualties was lower than American rhetoric suggested. Jump to Mogadishu, October 1993. Operation Gothic Serpent, the mission to capture Somali warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid, turns into the Battle of Mogadishu. 18 American soldiers killed, 73 wounded, images of dead American soldiers. Dragged through streets broadcast globally. 6 months later, all US forces withdrawn from Somalia. Aidid remained in power until his death in 1996, not from American action but from rival clan fighting. Then comes Iraq, 2003 to 2011. The invasion takes 3 weeks. Baghdad falls. Saddam Hussein is captured. Tried, executed. Mission accomplished banner on an aircraft carrier. And then the insurgency begins. By the time American forces withdraw in 2011, over 4,000 American troops are dead, 32,000 wounded, and estimates place the financial cost at over $1 trillion when including long-term care and debt servicing. The government installed by the United States proves so weak and corrupt that large portions of the country fall to the Islamic State within 3 years of American withdrawal. Then Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021, 20 years, $2.3 trillion, 2,461. American military deaths. The Taliban, the original target, outlasts the entire American presence and returns to power within weeks of the final withdrawal in August 2021. Not weakened, not chastened, stronger than they were in 2001, now equipped with billions of dollars of American military hardware left behind. 5 conflicts, 5 decades. Every single one begins with America holding every conventional advantage. Every single one ends with withdrawal and the original adversary either still in place or replaced by something worse. So when analysts and commentators claim that a war with Iran would be a quick, decisive American victory, the immediate question is, based on what? Based on what pattern of evidence from the last 50 years suggests the United States has the capability or the political will to achieve strategic victory against a determined, ideologically committed adversary fighting on its own territory? The assumption of inevitable American victory is not based on recent performance. It is based on nostalgia for a version of American military dominance that ended sometime around 1945 and has not existed in the same form since. And this is not about diminishing the extraordinary skill, bravery, and tactical excellence of American forces on the ground. In direct engagement, American troops win, American technology dominates, American logistics are unmatched. But wars are not won by tactics alone. Wars are won when military success translates into political objectives that can be sustained after the shooting stops, and that is where the pattern breaks down. That is where the last 50 years tell a different story than the one most people believe. The United States has the best military in the world for winning battles. It has not demonstrated the ability to win wars, and Iran has built its entire strategic doctrine around exploiting that gap. They do not need to win battles. They do not need to sink carriers or shoot down squadrons. They need to make victory so costly, so prolonged, so politically unbearable that the United States eventually leaves, because the pattern says that America always does. The question that should be keeping strategists awake is not whether American forces can destroy Iranian military assets. They can. The question is what happens after that. What does victory look like? Is it regime change? That requires invasion and occupation of a country with 88 million people, mountainous terrain twice the size of Iraq, and a population with a 40-year legacy of anti-American ideology embedded into state structure and education. Is victory the destruction of Iran's nuclear program? The key facilities are buried under mountains in reinforced bunkers that would require repeated strikes with bunker buster munitions, and even then, the knowledge and the scientists remain. Is victory the crippling of Iran's economy? Sanctions have been in place for decades. Iran's economy is battered but functional, and the government remains stable. Is victory the elimination of Iran's regional influence? That influence operates through proxy networks across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and beyond. You cannot bomb an ideology, you cannot airstrike a decentralized militia network, and you cannot occupy your way to compliance when the population views you as an invader and the government you are fighting has spent for decades preparing for exactly this scenario. The United States keeps approaching conflicts with a World War II model of victory. Destroy the enemy's military, topple the regime, occupy the territory, rebuild the government. That model worked when the enemy was a nation-state with conventional forces, a centralized command structure, and a population that could be pacified. It does not work against adversaries who fight asymmetrically, blend into civilian populations, operate through proxies, and treat time as a weapon. And Iran wrote the modern playbook on that style of warfare. Here is what makes Iran different from every other adversary the United States has faced in the last 50 years. Iran has had since 1979 to prepare for war with America. That is 45 years of doctrine development, weapons acquisition, alliance building, and strategic positioning built around a single assumption that one day the United States will try to destroy the Islamic Republic, and when that day comes, Iran's survival depends on making the cost unbearable. This is not Saddam Hussein's Iraq, where the military was designed to fight Iran in conventional warfare and collapsed when faced with American combined arms maneuver. This is not the Taliban. In 2001, scrambling with small arms and improvised tactics. This is a state that has industrialized asymmetry. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRG, is not structured like a traditional military. It operates as a parallel force alongside Iran's regular military, the Artesh, but with different objectives, different command chains and different rules. The IRG controls the Quds Force, the external operations wing responsible for building and supplying proxy militias across the region. It controls the naval forces that would close the Strait of Hormuz. It controls the missile programs, the drone programs, and the cyber capabilities. And critically, the IRG is ideologically indoctrinated in a way that regular conscript militaries are not. These are not troops who will surrender en masse when their supply lines are cut. These are forces that view martyrdom as religiously sanctioned and strategically valuable. In 2002, the United States Department of Defense spent $250 million on a war game called Millennium Challenge. The scenario was a U.S. invasion of a Middle Eastern country with geographic and military characteristics matching Iran. Retired Marine Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper was assigned to play the enemy commander. Van Riper understood something that the Pentagon planners were about to learn the hard way. Asymmetric warfare is not about matching your enemy's strengths. It is about exploiting their assumptions. When the simulated US Navy carrier group entered the Persian Gulf, Van Riper launched a coordinated surprise attack. Using small fast attack boats, shore-based anti-ship missiles, and even prop planes to simulate suicide attacks, he used motorcycle messengers instead of radio communications to avoid US signals intelligence. He targeted the command ships first, decapitating US coordination. In the opening engagement, Van Riper's forces sank 16 American warships, including a carrier. Casualty estimates for US forces ran into the thousands. The entire invasion was crippled before troops reached the beaches. The exercise was halted. The sunken ships were refloated. Van Riper's communications were restricted. The rules were changed to prevent certain tactics. The game resumed. And this time, the United States won decisively. Van Riper quit in protest, later stating publicly that the exercise had been rigged to achieve a predetermined outcome. The Pentagon dismissed his complaints and classified the details. But the lesson was already clear to anyone paying attention, in a realistic simulation, using the tactics Iran had been developing for decades. The United States lost catastrophically in the opening days. That was 22 years ago. Iran's capabilities have only expanded since then, and nothing in the American operational doctrine has fundamentally changed to address the vulnerabilities Van Riper exposed. The central pillar of Iranian military strategy is anti-access or area denial, known in military jargon as a two-ad. The goal is not to invade or project power beyond Iran's borders through conventional means. The goal is to make it impossible for an adversary to operate freely in the region. Iran has built overlapping layers of defense, designed to degrade, delay, and destroy any attacking force. The first layer is missile saturation. Iran possesses one of the largest and most diverse ballistic missile arsenals in the Middle East, with estimates ranging from 3,000 to 5,000 missiles of varying ranges and payloads. These are not the crude Scud variants. Of the 1990s, these include precision-guided systems like the Fatih 110, the Zulfikar, and the Sajil, capable of hitting targets over 2,000 kilometers away with increasing accuracy. Iran demonstrated this capability in January 2020 when it launched missile strikes on the Ain al-Assad airbase in Iraq, hitting specific structures and inflicting traumatic brain injuries on over 100 US personnel despite advance warning allowing partial evacuation. The message was not subtle. We can hit your bases and your defenses are not impenetrable. Every US military installation in the region, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia even. Diego Garcia further out falls within Iranian missile range. Carriers in the Gulf are stationary targets. Airbases are known coordinates. Iran does not need to win a prolonged missile exchange. It needs to inflict enough damage in the opening hours to complicate operations and demonstrate that American forces cannot act with impunity. The second layer is the Strait of Hormuz, the 30-mile-wide chokepoint through which approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass every single day, that represents about 21% of global petroleum liquids consumption. Closing the strait does not require controlling it. It requires making it too dangerous to transit. Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this. Naval mines, anti-ship missiles positioned along the coastline, swarms of fast attack craft operated by the IRGC Navy, and coastal artillery all create a lethal environment for commercial shipping and naval vessels alike. The US Navy could eventually clear the strait with minesweepers and air power, but not quickly and not without losses. And the moment the strait is threatened, insurance premiums on tanker traffic spike to prohibitive levels. Ships stop moving, oil markets panic, prices double, triple, or worse, depending on how long the closure lasts. Iran does not need to permanently close Hormuz, a credible threat. Sustained for even a week is enough to trigger a global economic crisis, and that crisis becomes a weapon against the United States, turning allies into voices demanding de-escalation because their economies cannot absorb the shock. During the 2019 tensions, when Iranian forces seized British-flagged tankers and allegedly attacked vessels with limpet mines, oil prices spiked and insurance markets reacted immediately. That was with no actual combat. Imagine the reaction to a hot war. The third layer is geographic. Iran is not a small country. It covers 1.6 million square kilometers. For comparison, Iraq is 438,000 square kilometers. Vietnam was 331,000. Afghanistan is 653,000. Iran is larger than all of them, with 88 million people, the majority of whom live in urban areas. The terrain is dominated by the Zagros and Alborz mountain ranges, with peaks exceeding 4,000 meters. These mountains run parallel to the western and northern borders, creating natural defensive barriers. Iran's critical infrastructure, including nuclear facilities like Fordo, are built deep inside mountains, hardened against airstrikes. The Fordo facility is buried under 7290 meters of rock and concrete. Conventional bunker buster munitions can damage it, but complete destruction would require repeated strikes, and the enrichment knowledge remains in the heads of scientists. And in distributed data, urban warfare in cities like Tehran, with a metropolitan population over 15 million, would be a nightmare exponentially worse than Fallujah or Mosul. The US military has no recent experience with urban combat at that scale, and the population, while not universally supportive of the regime, is largely nationalist. External invasion tends to unify populations against the invader, a lesson visible in Iraq where even groups opposed to Saddam resisted American occupation. The fourth layer is the proxy network, and this might be the most important piece because it extends Iran's reach and retaliatory capability far beyond its borders. Hezbollah in Lebanon is not just a militia. It is a state within a state, with an estimated rocket and missile arsenal exceeding 130,000, that is more firepower than most national militaries. In the 2006 Lebanon War, Hezbollah fought the Israeli Defense Forces to a standstill, firing over 4,000 rockets into Israel and using anti-tank guided missiles to destroy advanced Israeli armor. Israel, one of the most capable militaries in the world, achieved none of its stated objectives and withdrew after 34 days. Hezbollah has only grown stronger since. In Yemen, the Houthi movement, supported by Iran, has demonstrated the ability to strike deep into Saudi Arabia, using drones and missiles, including the September 2019 attacks on the Abqaiq oil processing facility, one of the most significant pieces of energy infrastructure on the planet. That attack temporarily cut Saudi oil production by half and sent shockwaves through global markets. In Iraq, Iranian-backed militias operate with near impunity, launching periodic rocket attacks on US bases and the Green Zone in Baghdad. After the US killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, these groups intensified operations. Soleimani's death was portrayed as a decapitation strike that would cripple Iranian regional operations. 2 years later, the Militias were still active, still attacking us positions, and the broader network showed no signs of collapse. The reason is structural. These are not top-down hierarchies dependent on a single leader. They are decentralized, locally embedded organizations with independent operational capacity, united by ideology and Iranian support, but not solely dependent on it. Do you think advanced technology can overcome geographic and strategic disadvantages, or does terrain always win in the end? Drop your take below. This brings us to the heart of the problem. The United States builds its military to fight and win conventional interstate wars. It is optimized for speed, precision, and overwhelming firepower delivered through combined arms operations air, land, and sea working in synchronized maneuver. This model is unbeatable in open terrain against conventional forces with centralized command. It is what crushed Iraqi forces in 1991 and again in 2003, but it is not designed for and has never successfully adapted to the kind of conflict Iran would impose. Iran will not meet American forces in open battle. There will be no tank columns to destroy from the air. No massed formations to obliterate with precision strikes. Instead, there will be missile salvos from hidden launchers, swarms of small boats in narrow waters, proxy attacks across a dozen countries, cyber attacks on infrastructure, and an insurgency that begins the moment foreign boots touch Iranian soil. The American way of war is built on the assumption that you can find the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them with superior firepower. But what happens when the enemy refuses to be found, refuses to be fixed, and treats casualties as investments rather than losses? What happens when the battlefield is not a desert or a jungle, but the entire regional order, including global energy markets and alliance structures? The assumption that air power alone can achieve victory is perhaps the most dangerous myth in the current discourse. Air power is extraordinarily effective at destroying fixed infrastructure bases, bridges, power plants, command centers. It can establish air superiority, suppress air defenses, and provide close support to ground forces. But it cannot occupy territory. It cannot hold ground. It cannot rebuild governance. And critically, it has never, in the history of modern warfare, independently forced a capable adversary to surrender. The strategic bombing campaigns of World War II did not break German or Japanese will. Those nations surrendered after ground invasions and the prospect of total annihilation. The air campaign over North Vietnam dropped more bombs than the entirety of World War II and did not force Hanoi to capitulate. The 1999 NATO bombing of Serbia lasted 78 days and eventually led to Serbian withdrawal from Kosovo. But that was a limited territorial dispute, not regime survival, and it still required the credible threat of ground invasion. In 2003, the air campaign against Iraq was devastating and effective, but it was the ground invasion that toppled the regime. Air power creates conditions. It does not by itself deliver political outcomes. In the case of Iran, an air campaign could destroy significant military infrastructure, set back the nuclear program, kill leadership figures, and crater the economy. But none of that ends the conflict. The IRG command structure is redundant and decentralized, the nuclear knowledge base is distributed, the proxies operate independently, and the population facing external attack is more likely to rally behind the government than overthrow it. So what comes after the airstrikes? If the answer is nothing, then the airstrikes accomplished nothing strategically. If the answer is invasion and occupation, then we need to look at what that actually requires. Occupying Iran would require a ground force exponentially larger than what was deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan. The standard counterinsurgency ratio, based on historical analysis, is roughly 20 troops per 1,000 inhabitants for effective population control. For a population of 88 million, that ratio suggests a force of 1.76 million troops. The entire active duty U.S. military is approximately 1.3 million personnel, spread across global commitments, even assuming a mobilization on the scale of World War II, which required a draft and total economic conversion to wartime production, sustaining an occupation force of that size in hostile, mountainous terrain is logistically and politically unfeasible. The United States never deployed more than 170,000 troops to Iraq at the height of the surge, and that was for a country with a third of Iran's population and less defensible geography. Afghanistan peaked at around 100,000 U.S. troops. Both of those deployments strained the military to breaking point, requiring extended tours, repeated deployments, and significant reliance on private contractors. An occupation of Iran would require triple or quadruple those numbers, sustained for years, possibly decades, with casualty rates that would make Iraq and Afghanistan look manageable. And for what objective? Installing a new government? The last time the United States intervened directly in Iranian governance was the 1953 coup that overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstalled the Shah. That intervention is a foundational grievance in Iranian political consciousness and a core narrative of the Islamic Republic, another American-imposed government, would face immediate, widespread, and violent resistance. There is no plausible scenario where the Iranian population accepts for an occupation peacefully. And then there is the cost. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, according to the Watson Institute's Costs of War project, have cost the United States over $8 trillion when including long-term obligations like veterans' care and interest on borrowed war funding, that is for two countries with a combined population smaller than Iran's. A full-scale war with Iran, including the initial campaign, occupation, reconstruction, and long-term care for veterans, would likely exceed $10 trillion over 2 decades. For context, that is more than half of current U.S. GDP. It would require either massive tax increases, which are politically toxic, or debt accumulation, on a scale that threatens the dollar's reserve currency status. And this is before accounting for the economic damage from oil market disruption. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed or contested for any significant period, the resulting spike in energy prices would trigger a global recession, the 1973 oil embargo, which reduced global supply by roughly 5%, caused stagflation, recession, and economic chaos across the developed world. A Hormuz closure would remove 21% of global oil supply overnight. The 2022 oil price spike following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which disrupted roughly 3% of global supply, sent prices over $120 per barrel and contributed to inflation rates not seen in decades. Now imagine a sustained disruption 3 times larger. Gasoline prices in the United States would double or triple. Heating costs would skyrocket, airlines would cut flights, recession would be almost immediate, and Europe and Asia, even more dependent on Gulf oil than the United States, would face economic catastrophe. China imports roughly 11 million barrels per day, much of it through the Strait of Hormuz. Japan and South Korea are similarly dependent. India relies on Gulf oil for over 60% of its supply. A Hormuz crisis does not just hurt Iran, it cripples the global economy, and every one of those countries becomes an instant advocate for de-escalation, turning what might start as a US-Iran conflict into a situation where America's own allies are pressuring Washington to stop fighting. What do you think happens to the global economy if the Strait of Hormuz closes for even 2 weeks? Be specific. There is another factor that rarely gets discussed in polite strategic circles, but it is perhaps the most decisive. The United States no longer has the political will to sustain a long, costly war. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observable fact. Public support for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan collapsed as casualties mounted, and objectives remained unclear. By the end of the Afghanistan war, polling consistently showed that over 70% of Americans believed the war was not worth fighting. The political consensus that enabled those wars disintegrated, and those were wars that, at least initially, had broad public backing in the wake of September 11th. A war with Iran would not have that advantage. There is no Pearl Harbor moment, no 9/11 scale attack to galvanize the public. Instead, there would be a preventive war sold on the basis of potential future threats, nuclear weapons, regional instability, terrorism. Those justifications might work for airstrikes. They will not sustain an occupation. The moment American casualties start coming home in significant numbers, the moment the economic costs become visible in gas prices and inflation, public opinion will turn. And unlike in previous eras, that opinion shift will be immediate, amplified by social media, and politically devastating. The Afghanistan withdrawal, chaotic as it was, remained broadly popular because the public wanted out. Politicians read that signal. The idea that the United States could fight a decades-long war in Iran with public support is fantasy. The whole structure of American political life, the 24-hour news cycle, the electoral calendar, the social media ecosystem, works against sustained sacrifice for unclear goals. And Iran knows this. Iranian strategy is not built around defeating American forces in battle. It is built around lasting longer than American political will, and the historical record suggests that is a very winnable strategy. Now consider the nuclear dimension, which adds another layer of complexity and risk. Iran's nuclear program is the stated justification for much of the pressure and many of the threats against Tehran. The concern from the US and Israeli perspective is that Iran will develop a nuclear weapon, achieve breakout capability, and fundamentally alter the regional balance of power. Intelligence estimates on how close Iran is to a weapon vary, but the consensus is that Iran has the technical knowledge and enough enriched uranium that, if it chose to weaponize, it could produce a crude device within months. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, was designed to extend that timeline to at least a year and provide monitoring to detect any breakout attempt. The United States withdrew from the JPOA in 2018 under the Trump administration, reimposed sanctions, and pursued a maximum pressure campaign designed to force Iran back to negotiations with stricter terms. Iran responded by progressively violating the deal's limits, enriching uranium to higher levels and restricting inspector access. By 2024, Iran is closer to a weapon than it was in 2015, and the monitoring regime is weaker. So the policy achieved the opposite of its stated goal. Now, if the United States launched a military strike to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, what happens? Best case, the strikes are successful and set the program back by several years, but the knowledge remains. The scientists remain, the centrifuges can be rebuilt, potentially in new hidden locations, and Iran's motivation to develop a weapon increases dramatically because the attack proves that only a nuclear deterrent can guarantee regime survival. North Korea is the model here. After being labeled part of the axis of evil and watching Iraq get invaded, North Korea pursued nuclear weapons with single-minded focus and successfully tested a device in 2006. Since then, despite sanctions, despite pressure, North Korea has not been invaded. The lesson is clear. If you want to guarantee that the United States will not overthrow your government, get a nuclear weapon. An attack on Iran's program accelerates that logic. Worse, it opens the possibility, however remote, that Iran might choose to conduct a rapid breakout during or immediately after an attack, calculating that overt weaponization is the only remaining deterrent that introduces nuclear brinksmanship into an already volatile situation. Let's talk about the proxy escalation ladder, because this is where a US-Iran war stops being a bilateral conflict and becomes a regional apocalypse. The moment American strikes hit Iranian territory, every Iranian-aligned group in the region has a decision to make. Hezbollah could launch its rocket arsenal at Israel, not as a symbolic gesture but as a sustained bombardment designed to overwhelm Israeli missile defenses and inflict mass civilian casualties. Israel would retaliate, likely with airstrikes on Hezbollah positions in Lebanon and possibly direct strikes on Iranian assets that pulls Israel fully into the war. Houthi forces in Yemen could escalate attacks on Saudi Arabia and Way, targeting oil infrastructure, desalination plants, airports. The Saudis, despite recent diplomatic outreach to Iran, would likely support US operations and become targets themselves. Iraqi militias could siege the US embassy in Baghdad, attack the remaining US troops in Iraq, and destabilize the Iraqi government, which is already fragile and divided between pro-Iran and pro-US factions. Syria, where Iranian forces and proxies are deeply embedded, becomes another battlefield. Suddenly, the war is not us versus Iran. It is a multi-front regional war involving Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Way, and potentially Turkey, all with their own objectives and grudges. Managing that escalation would require diplomatic and military resources on a scale not seen since World War II, and there is no guarantee it can be managed at all. Wars have a tendency to escape the control of the people who start them. If this analysis is hitting different than what you've heard elsewhere, subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown. There is also the Russia and China problem. Both nations have significant strategic interest in preventing American military success in Iran. Russia and Iran are aligned in Syria, cooperate on arms sales, and share a mutual interest in limiting American power in the Middle East. Russia would likely provide intelligence support to Iran, potentially supply advanced air defense systems if they have not already, and use the conflict to expand its own influence while the US is bogged down. China has even greater stakes. China is Iran's largest trading partner and a major buyer of Iranian oil, especially under sanctions when Iran sells at a discount. China's Belt and Road Initiative relies on stability in the Gulf and access to energy supplies. A U.S. war that destabilizes the region and spikes oil prices is a direct threat to Chinese economic growth. Beijing would not intervene militarily, but it would provide diplomatic cover, economic support, and potentially military equipment to Iran. More significantly, China could use the distraction of a U.S. war in the Middle East to make moves elsewhere, Taiwan being the most obvious flashpoint. If American carrier groups and strategic attention are focused on the Persian Gulf, the window for Chinese action in the Taiwan Strait opens. The United States would face the nightmare scenario of simultaneous crises into theaters without the force structure to dominate both. This is the multipolar world that has emerged over the last 2 decades. The United States no longer operates in an environment where it can focus overwhelming force on a single adversary without consequence elsewhere. Every commitment creates a vulnerability. Every deployment is a resource that cannot be used somewhere else, and adversaries are increasingly coordinated in exploiting that. So let us define what victory would actually look like, because this is where the conversation usually falls apart. In historical terms, victory in war meant the unconditional surrender of the enemy, the dismantling of their military, the occupation of their territory, the removal and replacement of their government, and the restructuring of their political system to align with the victor's interests. That is what happened to Germany and Japan in 1945. Total defeat, occupation, reconstruction, new constitutions, decades of alignment with the United States. That is what victory looked like, applying that standard to every American conflict since the United States has not achieved victory. Vietnam ended with American withdrawal and communist control of the entire country. Beirut ended with withdrawal after a terrorist attack. Somalia ended with withdrawal after a failed raid. Iraq ended with withdrawal, a weak client government, and large parts of the country falling to ISIS within 3 years. Afghanistan ended with withdrawal and the return of the Taliban. In each case, the United States won the battles. American forces were never defeated in the field, but winning battles is not the same as winning wars. Wars are won when you achieve your political objectives and those objectives remain stable after you leave. By that measure, the last clear American victory was World War II. Korea was a stalemate. The Gulf War in 1991 expelled Iraq from Kuwait but left Saddam in power, requiring another war 12 years later. Every other conflict has been some variation of managed failure. Now apply that to Iran. What is the political objective? If the goal is to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, airstrikes might delay the program but will not end it, and they will increase Iran's motivation to weaponize. If the goal is regime change that requires invasion, occupation, and nation building in a country with no history of stable democracy, deep sectarian and ethnic divisions, and a population that will resist for an occupation. If the goal is to eliminate Iran's regional influence, that influence is exercised through proxies that cannot be destroyed by conventional military force. If the goal is to secure the free flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, going to war with Iran is the surest way to disrupt that flow. Every plausible objective either requires costs that exceed any rational benefit or is unachievable through military means. So what does victory look like? The honest answer is that there is no victory scenario. There are only different degrees of failure, different timelines for withdrawal, and different costs in blood and treasure. The best-case scenario for the United States in a war with Iran is a prolonged stalemate that ends in negotiated settlement that looks very similar to the status quo, but with thousands dead, trillions spent, and the region more unstable than before. The worst case is a multi-front regional war, global economic collapse, a nuclear-armed Iran, and American strategic exhaustion that cedes the Middle East to Russian and Chinese influence. Neither of those is victory. Let's walk through three scenarios, because abstract strategy needs concrete outcomes to be understood. These are not predictions. They are models based on historical pattern, current capabilities, and rational actor assumptions. None of them end well. Scenario A: limited strikes and tit-for-tat escalation. In this scenario, the United States launches a series of airstrikes targeting Iranian nuclear facilities, IRG command centers, missile production sites, and naval assets. The strikes are extensive, involving hundreds of sorties from carrier-based aircraft, bombers flying from Diego Garcia and regional bases, and cruise missile launches from ships and submarines. The damage is significant. Key facilities are destroyed or heavily damaged. Casualties among IRG personnel and civilian contractors run into the hundreds, possibly low thousands. The United States declares the operation a success and waits for Iran's response. Iran does not collapse. Instead, Tehran calculates a proportional retaliation. Hezbollah launches a rocket barrage into northern Israel, forcing mass evacuations and overwhelming Iron Dome in localized areas. Houthi forces strike a major Saudi oil facility, causing fires and production shutdowns. Iraqi militias attack the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad with rockets and drones. Iranian cyber attacks target U.S. financial institutions and critical infrastructure, causing widespread disruptions. The Strait of Hormuz sees Iranian naval forces deploy mines and threaten transiting vessels, spiking insurance rates and causing shipping companies to halt traffic. Oil prices double within a week. The global economy begins to contract. The United States responds with additional strikes. Iran retaliates again, this time targeting a U.S. base in Qatar with ballistic missiles, inflicting casualties. The cycle continues. Neither side is willing to back down entirely, but neither is willing to commit to full-scale invasion. The conflict settles into a pattern of periodic strikes and retaliations, economic chaos, and regional instability. Diplomatically, the UN Security Council is paralyzed by Russian and Chinese vetoes. European allies publicly support the US but privately push for ceasefire because their economies are hemorrhaging after 6 months of this with oil prices destabilizing the global economy and domestic political pressure mounting. The United States and Iran enter in direct negotiations mediated by a third party, possibly Oman or Qatar. A ceasefire is brokered. Both sides claim victory. In reality, nothing has been resolved. Iran's nuclear program is delayed but not ended. US regional presence is diminished. The proxies are still operational, and the economic cost runs into the hundreds of billions. This is the best-case scenario, and it is still a strategic failure. Scenario B: regime change attempt and occupation nightmare. In this scenario, the United States decides that limited strikes are insufficient and commits to full regime change. The air campaign is followed by a ground invasion, with forces entering from Iraq and possibly Azerbaijan or Afghanistan if access can be negotiated. The initial advance is rapid in the flat border regions. American armor and air power dominate open terrain. Iranian conventional forces, the Artesh, suffer heavy casualties and fall back. But as American forces push deeper into the country and approach urban centers, the character of the war changes. The IRG activates pre-positioned insurgent cells. EIDs start appearing on supply routes. Ambushes become frequent. Urban warfare in cities like Avaz, Mashhad, and eventually Tehran turns into a grinding, bloody nightmare. American forces excel at combined arms maneuver in open country, but urban combat negates many of those advantages. Every building is a potential firing position. Every civilian is a potential combatant or human shield. Rules of engagement become impossible to enforce cleanly, and civilian casualties mount. International media broadcasts the images globally. The Iranian government relocates to a secondary site and continues to function. Calls for resistance are answered by a population that, whatever their grievances with the regime, views the invasion as foreign aggression. Insurgency spreads. American casualties, initially light, begin to climb. Convoys are hit. Bases are mortared. Helicopters are shot down. The occupation force, initially 200,000 troops, proves insufficient. Calls for reinforcements lead to mobilization of reserves and discussion of a draft, which triggers massive domestic protests in the United States. After 2 years, over 5,000 American troops are dead, 20,000 wounded, and there is no end in sight. The costs have exceeded $2 trillion. The Iraqi and Afghan wars are still fresh enough in memory. That public opposition is overwhelming. A presidential election turns on the war, and the new administration commits to withdrawal. American forces begin pulling out, leaving behind a shattered country, a weak provisional government, and a well-armed insurgency. Within a year, a new hardline government, possibly more extreme than the Islamic Republic, takes power. Iran is now more anti-American, more militant, and possibly nuclear-armed, having conducted a breakout during the chaos. This scenario is not hypothetical fantasy. It is the Iraq War model applied to a larger, more capable, more unified adversary, and it ends the same way: American withdrawal and strategic defeat. Scenario C: economic stranglehold and prolonged stalemate. In this scenario, the United States does not invade but instead intensifies the economic and covert war. Sanctions are expanded to target any entity doing business with Iran. Secondary sanctions threaten allies and partners who continue trade. Covert operations escalate with assassinations of nuclear scientists, sabotage of facilities, cyber attacks on infrastructure, and support for internal dissident groups. Iran retaliates through its proxies and cyber capabilities, but avoids direct military confrontation that would justify full-scale retaliation. The result is a grinding stalemate. Iran's economy suffers but does not collapse. The government remains in power, buoyed by nationalism and a siege mentality. The nuclear program continues in secret, with Iran playing a cat-and-mouse game with inspectors and intelligence agencies. Oil markets remain volatile, with periodic spikes whenever tensions escalate. U.S. forces remain deployed in the region at high cost, tying down resources and attention. Over years, the policy achieves no decisive outcome. Iran does not capitulate. The U.S. does not invade. The proxies continue to operate, and the entire region remains locked in a state of simmering crisis that could explode at any moment. This is essentially the current status quo, extended indefinitely. It is not victory. It is managed hostility with no resolution, and it suits neither side's long-term interests, but both are trapped in it because the alternatives are worse. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we break down the conflicts and power shifts the mainstream won't touch with this level of depth, and drop your answer below. If the US and Iran went to war tomorrow, which scenario do you think plays out? A. Limited strikes and stalemate. B. Regime change attempt and decade-long occupation nightmare. Or C. Economic stranglehold with no winner? Best analysis gets spinned. Next breakdown covers how China is quietly building the world's first post-American security architecture in the Middle East, and why Saudi Arabia is helping them do it. The pattern is not a theory. It is a 50-year evidentiary record written in trillions of dollars spent, thousands of lives lost, and strategic objectives abandoned. The United States has the finest military in the world for winning battles. It has not demonstrated the ability to translate that into sustainable political outcomes. When facing determined adversaries on their own territory, Vietnam taught that lesson, Beirut reinforced it. Somalia confirmed it. Iraq and Afghanistan turned it into doctrine. Iran has studied every single one of those failures and built a defensive strategy designed to ensure the pattern repeats. Geography favors the defender, asymmetric. Tactics negate conventional advantages. Proxy networks extend reach and complicate retaliation. Economic interdependence creates stakeholders in de-escalation, and American political will, however strong initially, has a breaking point measured in years, not decades. The question is not whether the United States could inflict devastating damage on Iran. It could. The question is whether that damage achieves any political objective worth the cost, and the historical record says no. The war everyone keeps talking about is the war the Pentagon knows it cannot win, not because American forces are not capable, but because victory, as traditionally defined, is not achievable through military means against this adversary in this environment, and until that reality is accepted, the pattern will continue. Different enemy, different terrain, same outcome. This has been an Atlas Geopolitical Analysis. All content is educational commentary based on historical patterns and publicly available information.